They threw hot coffee on the waitress for fun, laughing as she stood there scalded and humiliated. Just another black woman they could disrespect without consequences. What they didn't know, her boyfriend was a Korean mafia boss, and he'd just watched them do it. Bernice Jones had been on her feet for 9 hours straight. The Imperial Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom glowed under chandeliers that cost more than most people's houses, filled with executives and old money families who treated $1,000 bottles like water. Bernice moved through the space with practiced grace, refilling coffee, clearing dessert plates, maintaining the dignified composure her grandmother had taught her. She didn't mind the work. Honest work kept her tethered to something real, something separate from the darker world that waited for her after her shift ended. Fresh coffee for table 12, her supervisor signaled from across the room. Bernice lifted the ornate silver pot, its contents steaming, and made her way through the crowd of designer dresses and bespoke suits. Table 12 was trouble from the start. 4 young men in their late 20s, celebrating something they kept calling the Singapore deal. Their laughter had that particular pitch, the sound of people who'd never faced real consequences, the kind who saw service workers as props in their performance of wealth. Finally, the blonde one said as Bernice approached. His name tag read Alexander Sterling. Slicked back hair, a smile that had never been told it wasn't charming, cufflinks that probably cost what Bernice made in a month. Thought we'd have to get our own refills. My apologies, sir. Bernice kept her voice even, professional. She'd learned the armor of politeness long ago. As she poured, Alexander nudged his friend, showing him something on his phone that made them snicker. Bernice caught a glimpse photos of themselves at some yacht party, posing with bottles, acting like movie villains. Bernice, right? Alexander squinted at her name tag, then looked her up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. That's exotic. You got a boyfriend, Bernice? I'm in a relationship, sir. In a relationship, one of his friends mimicked, and they erupted in exaggerated laughter. Lucky guy. What's he do? Let me guess, security guard? Delivery driver? Bernice's grip tightened on the coffee pot. The liquid inside was near boiling. He's in import-export. This sent them into hysterics. Import-export. Classic. Alexander stood up, swaying slightly with expensive whiskey. The ballroom was loud enough that no one else had noticed yet. I got a question, Bernice. Alexander, sit down, one of his friends muttered, but he was grinning, phone already recording. I'm just curious, Alexander continued, louder now. A few nearby tables started to glance over. When you go home tonight, are you going to tell your little import-export boyfriend about how you spend your days serving your betters? Does he know his girl? He never finished the sentence. In one fluid motion, Alexander grabbed the coffee pot from Bernice's hand and tilted it. The scalding liquid poured over her head through her carefully maintained hair, down her face, soaking into her uniform. The shock of heat made her gasp, but she didn't scream. Didn't give them that satisfaction. The table erupted. They were howling, doubled over, phones out capturing every second. Oh my God, did you see her face? That's going viral. Someone make that a meme. Bernice stood perfectly still as the coffee dripped from her chin onto the imported marble floor. The pain was distant now, secondary to something colder crystallizing in her chest. She didn't cry, didn't curse. She simply looked at them with an expression that made Alexander's laughter falter. For just a split second, something in her eyes that suggested he'd made a calculation error he couldn't yet comprehend. Then her gaze shifted, just slightly, to the edge of the ballroom. Kim Tae-jun stood near the bar, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. He'd arrived early to surprise her at the end of her shift. Impeccably dressed in a black suit that whispered power, his expression was perfectly controlled except for his eyes. Those dark eyes had gone absolutely arctic. He hadn't moved, hadn't said a word. But something in the air changed, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. Bernice met his gaze. A silent acknowledgement passed between them. They don't know, her expression said. They will, his answered. Alexander and his friends were still laughing, still recording, completely oblivious to the elegant man by the bar whose absolutely still posture marked him as the most dangerous person in the room. Bernice turned without a word and walked toward the staff exit, her dignity intact despite the coffee staining her skin. Behind her, Tae-jun finally moved, setting down his glass with deliberate care and pulling out his phone. By the time Alexander Sterling stopped laughing, his life as he knew it had approximately 72 hours left. The penthouse was silent when Bernice arrived, but she knew Tae-jun was already there. She could always feel his presence, that particular quality of stillness that came from a man who'd made violence into an art form. She found him in the living room, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. He'd removed his jacket. His phone sat on the glass table beside a manila folder that hadn't been there this morning. "Sit," he said quietly, not turning around. Bernice moved to the leather sofa, her scalded skin still throbbing beneath the hurried first aid the hotel manager had administered, before sending her home with profuse apologies and a check she'd ripped up in the elevator. Taejun crossed to her with a medical kit she hadn't noticed, kneeling before her with a grace that belied his reputation. "Let me see." His fingers were gentle as he tilted her face toward the light, examining the reddened skin along her hairline and cheek. His jaw was set so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. He worked in silence, cleaning the burns with expert precision. This wasn't the first time he'd tended to injuries his own or others, but his hands trembled slightly as he applied the cooling gel to her face. The only sign of the fury she knew was building inside him. "It's not that bad," Bernice said softly. "Second degree at worst. It'll heal. It will scar." His voice was flat, factual, and somehow that was worse than if he'd shouted. He continued his ministrations with ritualistic care, wrapping gauze around her forearm where the coffee had soaked through her sleeve. Each movement deliberate, almost ceremonial. When he finished, he remained kneeling before her, his hands resting on her knees. Finally, he looked up, and Bernice saw something in his eyes that made her chest tighten. Not just rage, though, that was there, burning cold and absolute. But pain, raw, undisguised pain. "They hurt you," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "In public. For entertainment. Taejun, do you know what that means?" He stood abruptly, crossing to the table and picking up the folder. "In my world, there are rules. Old rules. Myeonmok face, honor, the respect that cannot be compromised. An insult to my woman is an insult to me, and insults to me are answered with blood." He opened the folder, laying out photos across the table. Alexander Sterling, his 3 friends, addresses, family trees, financial records, already compiled, already analyzed. "Ju-won sent this 30 minutes ago," Taejun continued, his voice taking on that particular calm that meant someone was about to suffer. "Alexander Sterling, 28. Trust fund child. His father owns Sterling Global Properties, commercial real estate across 12 countries. The others are the same. Wealthy. Connected. Untouchable." He turned to face her fully, and Bernice saw the man who'd built an empire in the shadows, who'd climbed over bodies to reach the top of the Korean underworld's hierarchy. They think their money makes them gods. They think there are no consequences because there never have been. He moved toward her again, cupping her bandaged face with both hands. "They burned you, Bernice. They humiliated you. They laughed. What are you going to do?" Something flickered in his expression, not quite a smile. Too cold for that. In the old days, I would have had them in a warehouse within the hour. By morning, their families would have been identifying bodies. He pressed his forehead to hers, careful of her injuries. "But you've made me better than that. More patient. More creative." He pulled back, and now his eyes held a calculated darkness that Bernice recognized. This was the man who'd orchestrated hostile takeovers of rival organizations without firing a single shot. Who'd bankrupted competitors through legal channels before crushing what remained in the shadows. "I'm going to take everything from them," Taejun said simply. "Their money, their status, their futures, and I'm going to make sure they know exactly why it's happening. By the time I'm finished, Alexander Sterling will understand that the cost of a $5 cup of coffee was his entire world." He kissed her forehead gently, a stark contrast to the promise of destruction in his words. "No one touches what's mine. No one." Ju-won arrived at dawn, carrying a leather briefcase and the particular expression he wore when he'd found someone's weakness. He'd been Taejun's strategist for 15 years, turning the Jopak boss's instinct for violence into surgical precision. "Alexander Jonathan Sterling," Ju-won began, spreading documents across Taejun's desk like a prosecutor building a case. 28 years old, Princeton dropout, 3 DUIs expunged from his record. His father paid $200,000 to make a sexual assault allegation disappear in 2021. Taejun studied the photographs. Alexander at charity galas, yacht parties, celebrity events, always with that same entitled smirk. Always surrounded by people who looked just like him. Born into wealth, raised to believe consequences were for other people. "The family fortune," Ju-won continued, pulling up a financial chart on his tablet. "Sterling Global Properties. 63 commercial buildings across Asia, Europe, and North America. On paper, they're worth $1.8 billion. In reality, he smiled thinly. It's a house of cards built on over-leveraged debt and shell company financing. The Singapore deal they were celebrating, it's their last desperate play to stay solvent. Weaknesses, everything. Ju-won's fingers danced across the screen, highlighting vulnerabilities. The sole property is financed through Hanmi Bank, where we have 3 board members in our pocket. Their London acquisition used laundered Russian money that MI6 would be very interested in. The Panama holdings? Constructed with materials from our competitor's supply chain. 1 inspection report away from condemnation. Taejun leaned back, fingers steepled. The son's friends? Marcus Chen family owns Chen Medical Supply. FDA violations waiting to be discovered. David Rothstein hedge fund manager. Insider trading evidence we acquired last year. James Whitmore III, his family's pharmaceutical company, has been diluting cancer medications. We have the lab reports. You've been busy. You pay me to be thorough. Ju-won closed the tablet. The question is approach. We could move quickly, crash their stock, trigger the investigations, force bankruptcy within a month. Or, slowly, Taejun interrupted, his voice carrying the cold patience of a predator. I want them to feel it happening. Every morning they wake up, something else should be gone. A contract falls through. A partner pulls out. A loan gets called in. I want Alexander Sterling to watch his father's empire crumble and know, with absolute certainty, that it started the moment he poured that coffee. Ju-won nodded, already making notes. Elegant destruction, my specialty. No bodies, Taejun continued, standing and moving to the window where the city sprawled below like a game board. No violence that can be traced. No evidence that points to us. This must look like natural business failure. Market forces. Unfortunate timing. He turned back, and his smile was colder than his rage had been. But I want them to know. At the end, when they've lost everything, I want Alexander Sterling to understand exactly what he took from me when he hurt her. The destruction must be elegant, Ju-won repeated, understanding perfectly. No blood, Taejun confirmed, only ruin. The first domino fell on a Tuesday morning at 9:47 a.m., when Alexander Sterling's Black American Express card declined at his favorite cafe in Tribeca. He laughed it off, used another card, assumed it was a system error. By noon, all 5 of his cards had been frozen. There must be some mistake. Alexander told the private banker his father kept on retainer, his voice still carrying that casual confidence of someone who'd never been told no. Run them again. Mr. Sterling, it's not the cards. The banker's voice had lost its usual obsequious warmth. The IRS has initiated a comprehensive audit of your trust fund. All accounts are frozen pending investigation. It's highly unusual. The paperwork is immaculate. 3,000 miles away, Taejun received the confirmation with a slight nod. The IRS auditor in question had gambling debts that mysteriously disappeared the same day he'd agreed to expedite Alexander's case. Not illegal, just fortuitous timing. By Wednesday, Sterling Global Properties lost its anchor tenant in the Seoul building. Samsung suddenly invoked an obscure contract clause, allowing early termination. The clause had been buried on page 47 of the lease, dormant for 6 years until Hanmi Bank's legal team discovered it during a routine review that wasn't routine at all. It's just bad luck, Alexander's father told the board of directors, though his hands shook as he said it. Market fluctuations. We'll recover. Thursday brought worse news. The Singapore deal, the massive commercial development that would have saved the company, collapsed when their primary investor, a Taiwanese conglomerate, abruptly withdrew. Something about unforeseen complications and risk assessment concerns. The Taiwanese CEO never mentioned the courtesy call he'd received from a Korean associate, or the photographs of his mistress that had been politely returned to him with assurances they'd remain private as long as certain business relationships were reconsidered. Alexander felt the first real flutter of panic when his penthouse landlord called Friday afternoon. The building had been sold to a new property management company. They were exercising their right to non-renewal. He had 90 days to vacate. He didn't know the new property management company was owned by a subsidiary of a subsidiary that traced back to one of Taejun's legitimate business fronts. The paper trail was clean, legal, impossible to challenge. This is insane, Alexander told his friends over drinks that night, though Marcus had to cover the tab because Alexander's accounts were still frozen. It's like someone's targeting us. Paranoid much? David laughed, but it sounded forced. His hedge fund had received a surprise SEC inquiry that morning. Nothing serious yet, just questions. Very specific questions. By Saturday, Alexander's Instagram, where he'd posted the video of Bernice with the caption, "When you're too hot to handle," had been reported so many times for harassment that his account was suspended pending investigation. In his penthouse across the city, Taejun watched the social media storm with cold satisfaction. The video had gone viral, but not the way Alexander intended. Activists had found it. Lawyers had found it. Journalists had found it. The narrative was shifting, and Alexander Sterling was becoming a symbol of everything people hated about wealth and privilege. Juwon sent a single text, "Phase 1 complete. They're starting to notice." Taejun replied, "Good, let them panic. The real damage hasn't even begun." Alexander Sterling hadn't slept properly in 5 days. Every phone call made him flinch. Every email notification sent his heart racing. The walls of his temporary apartment, a degrading step down from his penthouse, felt like they were closing in. "It has to be the Vanderbilts," he told Marcus and David over coffee in a booth at the back of a diner, somewhere cheap where none of them would normally be caught dead. James had stopped answering his calls entirely. "Remember that polo club thing last year, when I hooked up with Catherine Vanderbilt at her own engagement party? The Vanderbilts don't operate like this," Marcus muttered, dark circles under his eyes. His family's medical supply company had failed 3 separate FDA inspections in 1 week. Inspections that had found violations dating back years. Violations that should have been buried in paperwork but somehow surfaced with photographic evidence. "This is coordinated. Professional." David hadn't spoken much. His hedge fund was under formal SEC investigation now. Insider trading charges that he absolutely was guilty of, but the evidence should have been impossible to obtain. Someone had gotten into encrypted servers, pulled communications that were supposed to be deleted, built an airtight case. "Maybe it's corporate espionage," Alexander suggested, grasping at theories. The Singapore deal had a lot of interested parties. Chen Industries pulled out last minute. "Chen Industries pulled out because my father's business is collapsing," Marcus snapped. "Because someone tipped off every regulatory agency about every shortcut we've ever taken. This isn't about your deal, Alex. This is bigger." None of them mentioned the video. The one that had gone viral, been picked up by news outlets, sparked think pieces about wealth and entitlement. The waitress with coffee dripping down her face had become a symbol, and they'd become villains in a narrative they couldn't control. But they still didn't connect the dots. She was just a waitress, a nobody. This level of destruction required resources, connections, power that existed in an entirely different stratosphere. Across the city, Bernice sat in Taejun's study, watching the evening news on his wall-mounted screen. Sterling Global Properties was the lead story, stock plummeting, investors fleeing, the father giving a stammering press conference about temporary setbacks. Chen Medical Supply faces federal charges. The anchor continued, and Marcus Chen's father appeared on screen, looking 20 years older than his last public appearance. Taejun entered silently, setting a cup of tea beside her. His hand rested briefly on her shoulder, and she covered it with her own. "The Rothstein Fund has agreed to a settlement with the SEC," the news continued. "Sources say David Rothstein Jr. may face criminal charges pending." "You're dismantling their entire world," Bernice said quietly. "Yes. They still don't know it's you." "They will." Taejun sat beside her, his expression calm, almost serene. "When everything is gone, when they're standing in the ruins of their privilege, I'll make sure Alexander Sterling understands exactly what that moment of cruelty cost him." On screen, Alexander appeared in paparazzi footage, leaving his lawyer's office, looking hunted and hollow. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by paranoid, darting eyes. "He looks scared," Bernice observed. "Good." Taejun's hand found hers. "He should be. Fear is just the beginning." The burns on Bernice's face were healing, but the scars would remain. Light, barely visible, but permanent. She touched them absently as she watched the men who'd marked her unravel on national television. She should have felt satisfaction. Instead, she felt something colder. The understanding that she'd crossed a threshold she couldn't return from. The man beside her had weaponized his empire for her dignity, and there was no putting that power back in its box. "How much further?" she asked. Taejun smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. "We're only halfway done." Bernice found Taejun in his private office at 3 a.m, surrounded by documents and surveillance photos. He looked like he hadn't slept, though his suit remained perfectly pressed, his appearance immaculate as always. Control, even an obsession. "Juwon says Marcus Chen's father had a heart attack today," she said from the doorway. He's in critical condition. Taejun didn't look up from the papers. He'll survive. The ambulance arrived in 4 minutes. I made sure of it. You made sure. Bernice stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. Taejun, you're monitoring their medical emergencies now? I'm monitoring everything. He finally met her eyes, and she saw something burning there that worried her. Not rage anymore, something colder, more consuming. Purpose without limit. The father's collapse was natural, stress-induced, but I won't have deaths complicating the operation. The operation? Bernice moved closer, her reflection catching in the window behind him. The scars on her face were fading but visible in certain light. A permanent reminder. That's what this is to you now? An operation? It's justice. It's becoming something else. She sat on the edge of his desk, forcing him to look at her. I see it in you. That look you get when you're in too deep, when the vendetta becomes more important than the reason you started. Taejun's jaw tightened. They hurt you, and you've destroyed them for it. Their businesses are ruined. Their reputations are shattered. Alexander Sterling is living in a studio apartment and can't get a job at Starbucks because his face is synonymous with entitled cruelty. She reached for his hand, holding it between both of hers. I'm not asking you to stop. I know you can't. It's not who you are, and I've accepted that. But I'm asking you to control it. Control. He said the word like it tasted bitter. My dignity doesn't require their deaths, Taejun. It requires accountability. It requires them to understand what they did and live with that knowledge every single day. She touched his face, making him focus. If bodies start appearing, this becomes about you and your power. I become a footnote. But if you take everything else, their money, their status, their futures, and leave them breathing, that's a different kind of punishment. That's Yonjoda. Permanent. She'd used the Korean word deliberately. Something shifted in his expression. The fever pitch of his obsession cooled slightly, redirected by her logic. This was why they worked. She could reach the part of him that still calculated instead of just destroyed. No deaths, he said finally. But everything else is forfeit. Everything else, Bernice agreed. Alexander Sterling will live long enough to understand exactly what he lost and why. He'll spend decades knowing that one moment of cruelty cost him his entire future. Taejun pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. But he will live. They all will. Is that enough? It's perfect. She kissed him softly. Ruin them. Just don't become a monster to do it. Too late for that, he murmured against her lips. Then be my monster, the one who loves me enough to stay controlled. He pulled back, studying her face with an intensity that would have frightened anyone else. Then he nodded once, a promise sealed. No blood, Taejun said. Only ashes. Robert Sterling had aged 20 years in 3 weeks. The man who entered the private dining room of the Lotus Garden restaurant looked nothing like the commanding real estate mogul who'd graced Forbes covers. His suit hung loose on a frame that had shed weight from stress. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched his briefcase. Taejun sat at the far end of the table, positioned so the light fell across his face in a way that made his expression unreadable. He'd chosen this restaurant deliberately, one of his legitimate holdings, elegant and private, where conversations disappeared into soundproofed walls. Mr. Kim, Robert began, his voice hoarse. Thank you for agreeing to meet. I understand you're a very difficult man to reach. I make exceptions for interesting opportunities. Taejun gestured to the chair across from him. Please, sit. Robert practically collapsed into the seat, setting his briefcase on the table with shaking hands. I'll be direct. Sterling Global Properties is facing a perfect storm of setbacks. Market conditions, regulatory scrutiny, investors pulling out, it's unprecedented. But the foundation is solid. With the right capital infusion, we can weather this and emerge stronger. How much? 50 million. Robert pulled out projections, spreadsheets, documents that Taejun didn't bother looking at. Full partnership terms, priority returns, seat on the board. You'd essentially own 40% of a company that, once recovered, will be worth... Why me? Taejun interrupted, his tone polite but cold. Robert hesitated. You have a reputation. Someone who can move money quickly, who has connections that can smooth certain difficulties. I'm not naive about who you are, Mr. Kim. But I'm desperate. Desperate men make poor partners. Desperate men are honest. Robert leaned forward. I have 300 employees whose livelihoods depend on this company. I have investors, commitments, projects half completed across 12 countries. I'm not asking for charity. I'm offering you a legitimate business opportunity. Taejun pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and turned it toward Robert. The video played Alexander laughing, the coffee pot tilting, Bernice's face as the scalding liquid poured over her, the son's voice, "When you're too hot to handle." Robert's face went white. That's my son. That video, it went viral. He made a terrible mistake. But, do you know who that woman is? Taejun's voice remained perfectly calm, but something in the room shifted, grew colder. A waitress. Alexander apologized. We offered her compensation, medical expenses. She's mine. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Robert's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Understanding dawned slowly, horribly. Your son didn't just humiliate a waitress, Mr. Sterling. He declared war on me. In my world, we have a concept myeonmok. Face, honor, the respect that cannot be compromised without consequence. Taejun leaned forward, and his smile was colder than his rage had ever been. Your son spilled a $5 cup of coffee for entertainment. The price is your entire legacy. Please, Robert's voice cracked. He's young, stupid. He didn't know. Ignorance isn't immunity. It's just another form of arrogance. Taejun stood, buttoning his jacket. Your company will collapse, Mr. Sterling. Your son will spend his life understanding what that moment cost, and you'll spend yours knowing you couldn't protect either. I'll give you anything. You have nothing I want except your ruin. Taejun paused at the door. It's already paid, in Myeonmok. The text message came from a blocked number. Your father needs you. Warehouse District, Pier 47. Come alone or he dies. Alexander Sterling had nothing left to lose, and everything to fear. His father had disappeared 2 days ago, last seen leaving that disastrous meeting with the mysterious investor. The police had been useless. Private investigators found nothing. And now this. He arrived at the abandoned warehouse just after midnight, his hands shaking as he pushed open the rusted door. The space inside was surprisingly clean, well lit by portable work lights that cast harsh shadows across concrete floors. And there, in the center, sat a single chair facing a camera on a tripod. Behind it stood a man Alexander had never seen before, but somehow recognized instantly. Impeccably dressed in a black suit, dark hair swept back, expression calm and absolutely terrifying in its composure. Mr. Sterling, Taejun said pleasantly. Please, sit. We have business to conclude. Where's my father? Alexander's voice cracked. The message said, Your father is at home, safe, probably drinking himself into oblivion over his failures. Taejun gestured to the chair. The message was a courtesy. I could have simply had you taken, but I wanted you to come willingly. To understand you still have choices, even now. 2 men appeared from the shadows, not threatening, just present. A reminder that leaving wasn't one of those choices. Alexander sat. His bravado, his entitlement, everything that had defined him, had been stripped away over the past month, leaving behind a hollow, frightened shell. Taejun pulled out a tablet, tapped the screen, and turned it toward Alexander. His father's voice filled the warehouse. The complete financial collapse of Sterling Global Properties can be traced directly to a single incident. My son Alexander assaulted a young woman at the Imperial Plaza Hotel. That woman had connections I didn't understand until it was too late. Everything we've lost, the investors, the contracts, the regulatory scrutiny, it's retribution for my son's cruelty. This isn't market forces. This is justice. Alexander's face went gray. You made him. I made him tell the truth, Taejun corrected. Your father finally understands cause and effect. Now it's your turn. He gestured to the camera. You're going to record a statement. You'll detail exactly what you did that night, the coffee, the humiliation, the laughter. You'll name your friends who participated. You'll apologize with specificity and sincerity, and you'll acknowledge that every consequence you faced was earned. And if I refuse, then this recording of your father's confession goes to every media outlet, every investor, every business partner he has left. The Sterling name becomes permanently synonymous with racial violence and corporate corruption. Taejun's smile was knife-sharp. Or you take responsibility, and your father gets to fade into obscurity with some dignity intact. You're destroying my life either way. Yes, but you get to choose how. Taejun pressed record on the camera. Your life or your father's legacy. Decide. Alexander stared at the red light, understanding finally crystallizing. The waitress, the man watching from the bar, the systematic destruction of everything he'd ever known. He'd spilled coffee on a mafia boss's girlfriend and laughed about it. "My name is Alexander Sterling," he began, his voice hollow. "On October 15th, I committed an act of cruelty." Tae-jun watched impassively as Alexander dismantled himself on camera, word by word, truth by truth. This recording would follow him forever, every job application, every background check, every attempt to rebuild. When it was finished, Tae-jun stopped the recording and pocketed the device. "That's it?" Alexander asked. "I'm free to go?" "You were never not free, Mr. Sterling. That's the lesson. You're free to live with what you've done, free to face every consequence, free to understand that actions have weight." Tae-jun turned toward the door. "You're just no longer free from accountability." The penthouse was quiet when Bernice arrived, the city lights sprawling below like scattered diamonds. Tae-jun stood by the window, his familiar position, the place he went when making decisions that would alter lives. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and something in his expression made her pause. "It's done," he said simply. "Alexander's confession will be released tomorrow morning, controlled leak to 3 major outlets. By noon, the story will be everywhere, not as a viral joke, but as a cautionary tale. The others are facing their own reckonings. Legal, professional, social, nothing that can be traced to me." Bernice set down her bag, studying his face. "You don't look satisfied." "I'm not sure satisfaction is what I feel." He crossed to the bar, poured 2 glasses of whiskey, handed her one. "I destroyed 4 families to restore your dignity. Bankrupted companies, ended careers, ensured that everyone involved will spend years, maybe decades, recovering from one moment of cruelty." He paused. "And I'd do it again without hesitation. That's what concerns me." "Tae-jun, let me finish." He set down his glass. "You've been with me for 3 years. You know what I am, what I do. But you've kept yourself separate from the worst of it. Working at the hotel, maintaining your independence, living in both worlds." His eyes met hers. "That separation is gone now. What I did for you, what I'm capable of, you can't unknow it. And I won't pretend the danger isn't real." Bernice felt her heart hammering. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'll give you a choice I've never given anyone." Tae-jun moved closer, his voice steady but his eyes betraying emotion he rarely showed. "I can set you up anywhere in the world. New identity, financial security, protection from a distance. You'd be safe, anonymous, free to build a life that doesn't include looking over your shoulder or wondering if my enemies will use you to hurt me. Or you stay, fully in this world, fully with me, understanding that my protection is absolute but so are the risks. There's no middle ground anymore, Bernice. You're either completely in or completely out." She should have needed time to think, should have weighed the options, considered the implications. But standing there, looking at the man who'd orchestrated the systematic destruction of 4 lives because someone hurt her, Bernice realized she'd already decided weeks ago. "When I was growing up," she said quietly, "my grandmother used to say that dignity isn't something given, it's something you claim and defend. For years, I thought defending mine meant staying independent, proving I didn't need anyone's protection." She stepped closer, taking his hands. "But that night at the hotel, those men saw me as disposable, entertainment. And the only thing that stopped them from facing 0 consequences was you, Bernice. My dignity is safer with your violence than with their kindness," she said firmly, "because their kindness is conditional, performative. It evaporates the moment I'm no longer useful or entertaining. But your violence?" She touched his face. "Your violence says I matter, that harming me has consequences, that I'm not disposable. You understand what you're choosing? The danger, the moral complexity, the fact that I'll never be anything other than what I am? I'm choosing you," Bernice said. "All of it. The protection and the danger, the love and the darkness. I'm choosing to stop pretending I can live halfway in your world." Tae-jun pulled her close, and she felt the tension leave his body. "Then you're mine, completely." "I always was," she whispered. "I just needed the world to try taking me from you to realize it." 3 months later, Bernice stood in the lobby of the newly opened Community Dignity Center, watching volunteers distribute food and resources to families who'd been displaced by gentrification. The building had been purchased through Kim Foundation Holdings, one of Tae-jun's legitimate fronts, now with a very public, very respectable face. Her face. "Miss Jones," a young woman approached, clipboard in hand. "The legal aid clinic is at capacity. We have 15 more people waiting. Should we schedule overflow appointments?" "No overflow," Bernice said firmly. Add more lawyers. If people need help, we help them today. That's the entire point. The woman nodded and hurried off. Bernice had discovered she was good at this, channeling the same dignity she'd maintained while serving entitled millionaires into something that actually mattered. The foundation provided legal services, job training, emergency housing assistance, all legitimate, all clean, all operated with the same ruthless efficiency that Tae-jun applied to his other ventures. She'd quit the Imperial Plaza Hotel the day after making her choice. Walked in, collected her final paycheck, and never looked back. The manager had seemed relieved she'd become infamous after the video, a symbol that made wealthy patrons uncomfortable. Good. She hoped they choked on their discomfort. Tae-jun arrived just before noon, immaculate as always in a charcoal suit, flanked by Ju-won. To anyone watching, he was a successful businessman checking on his charitable investment. Only Bernice saw the way his eyes tracked every exit, every person, the constant calculation of threats and angles. How's our social conscience today? He asked quietly, pressing a kiss to her temple. Expensive, she replied with a slight smile. We're burning through the quarterly budget in 6 weeks. Then we'll double it. He glanced around the bustling center. This is good for the community, and good for us. Good for legitimacy, he meant. Good for reputation laundering. Bernice didn't pretend otherwise. The foundation was partially genuine charity and partially calculated image management. She'd made peace with the duality. Have you seen today's news? Ju-won asked, pulling up his tablet. Alexander Sterling's face appeared a booking photo from a shoplifting arrest. Can't find work, trust fund gone, living in subsidized housing. He tried using a fake name on the job application. They found the video anyway. Bernice studied the photo. Alexander looked 40, not 28, hollow-eyed and broken. His friends had scattered to similar fates. Marcus working retail after his family disowned him. David banned from finance permanently. James disappeared entirely after his family's pharmaceutical scandal. Good, she said simply. Tae-jun's hand found hers, and she squeezed it. No regrets, no second thoughts. These men had seen her as nothing, and in return, they'd become nothing. Perfect symmetry. That evening, back at the penthouse, Bernice stood at the window where Tae-jun usually contemplated his empire. He joined her, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. Any doubts? He asked. None. She leaned back against him. I'm doing real good with money from real bad sources, and I sleep fine. That makes you dangerous. That makes me yours. She turned in his arms. We're building something here. Something that matters, even if the foundation is mortar mixed with blood money. The best empires always are, Tae-jun murmured. And you're the only person I trust to keep mine human. Below them, the city glittered with possibility and threat, fortune and ruin, all the contradictions that had always existed. But up here, in this space they'd carved out together, Bernice Jones and Kim Tae-jun had created their own balance, her dignity and his violence, her conscience and his power, inseparable and absolute. The scars on her face had faded to thin lines, visible only in certain light. She touched them absently, remembering. Do you ever regret how far you went? She asked. Tae-jun's answer was immediate. Only that I didn't go further. She smiled, dark and satisfied. Good answer. Outside, somewhere in the city, Alexander Sterling was learning what permanent consequences felt like. And in the penthouse high above, the waitress and the mafia boss stood together, watching their kingdom burn bright and build anew, exactly as they'd chosen. The screen faded to black. Then Bernice's face appeared in soft focus, the faint scars on her cheek catching the light. Behind her, the city glowed through floor-to-ceiling windows, and a shadowy figure stood watching, protective, possessive, eternal.